Have you ever experienced combat in games? Defeated tough foes or easy foes, dashing to evade incoming attacks and inflicting damage against enemies? Well, I'm sure you have. Video game combat is a very common pattern in games today and always has been. For example, this is Mortal Kombat, created in 1992, which had been one of the first video games to implement hand-to-hand combat. For over the last decades, combat systems have evolved and set out different branches of approaching it, which different games adapt to. In this video, we'll be talking about different types of combat system in games and talk a little bit about on what exactly is a combat system and specifically more on hand-to-hand combat. So, what is a combat system? Essentially, a combat system is a mechanic that handles all of the functionality that is involved or related to the combat in the game. Now, that definition sounds simple and unambiguous, right? But it's not. Combat systems can have many different features, whether it be slightly different from others or just completely new. The most common set of features a combat system will have are being able to attack and block. And a lot of combat systems use those elements and expand them into sub-elements. The attack and block features of a combat system is the bone structure of a combat system. Every combat system demands these features guaranteed, and it's just about implementing them in different ways.
See what you can really do.
So, let's start with the attacking feature, which every combat system should implement, because without it, you can't really consider it a combat system. Attacking is simply the feature of being able to perform an action that inflicts damage on beings that have health or are registered to be attackable, consequently withdrawing some health from them from being attacked. Some combat systems may implement fast or slow attacking, or letting the player choose either one. Such as in the Soulsborne games, you have something called a build, which is a model used to represent your stats, weapons, or other related features which have influence on the speed of your attacks, which is a really great integration to the combat system because it allows for you to choose your own needs for your own playstyle. Attacking in games developed by From Software, for example Dark Souls or Elden Ring, is a much more strategizing process which requires a lot of thinking. Especially if you compare those games to other games like Marvel's Spider-Man, which have very easy to maneuver attacking with little thinking involved. In Dark Souls, you really must decide your attacks based on the build you are and show a lot of patience and respect to the realism of the combat, as the Dark Souls franchise is precise with their attack collision detection because the precise geometry of every weapon in the game is used as the collision itself, and not some invisible box or any other workarounds. And then there's blocking, which is obviously very important as well, because how are you going to defend yourself against NPCs with an integrated combat system otherwise? Blocking is kind of the opposite of attacking, maybe not literally, but intuitively can be thought of as so, such that instead of inflicting damage on a blocking NPC, the NPC inflicts damage on you whilst blocking. Blocking is the mechanic of applying resistance from damage inflictions. Perhaps some blocking mechanics will work so that you get slightly damaged when blocking, or none. Fighting hand-to-hand combat is fun, especially against players. But there's nothing truly more exciting, fun, and daunting than fighting against huge monsters with their own integrated combat system, which games like Dark Souls and Elden Ring have. You oftentimes find yourself studying the attack patterns and behavior of NPC enemies, and that feeling once you finally beat them after countless attempts at trying so is absolutely unbeatable. In my personal opinion, that's what a true gamer should experience. When developers make combat system integration to NPCs in their games, they have to take into account many different aspects, such as what the reactions to a set of opponents' reactions are, and such implementations can get very complicated. But the results can be very incredible if done so right, with the right programming implementations to mimic an artificial intelligence. A great product can be promised. And keep in mind, no games actually implement a neural network, but instead just a bunch of conditions that have attached instructions to them when met. Though a neural network for a combat system is definitely not something impossible to happen, considering how fast it's been growing. So besides blocking, attacking, and dodging, are there any other attributes that make up a combat system? Certainly. Those are just the base structure of a combat system, and every system should be built from that. For example, blocking in many games has an additional feature called parrying, which is a special execution that lets you deal a significant amount of damage compared to how much you usually do. And this is always triggered by pressing some button at the perfect time when the enemy is about to hit you. But are there any things that you should avoid when developing a combat system? Of course, there's always problems that can occur and things that need to be dealt with when making systems, and with combat systems, it's no different. Problems like extreme unfairness or impossible victories. Though, to be fair, the combat system against the enemies in the Soulsborne games, for example, is very unfair, but they do it right, and they practically invested the majority of their time perfecting the combat system in their games. You should always add something called a debounce to your combat system, which is a technical term basically analogous to what a cooldown is. For example, you wouldn't want the player to be able to attack at an extreme speed such that the enemy falls instantly if the player spams. Now let's talk a little bit more technical on combat systems, something called frame data. If you've ever truly played the Mortal Kombat, Injustice League, or Street Fighter games, you might know what frame data is already. It basically is a model to show the amount of frames each part of an attack takes, and is crucial for developing a balanced combat system. For every attack, we can break it down to 3 states: the startup state, the active state, and the recovery state. As soon as the attack begins, you begin in the startup state, which is basically the state that represents the attack being prepared to inflict damage. And so that brings us to the active state, which represents the moment that the attack can inflict damage if something is hit. And then finally, the recovery state is when the character that did the attack recovers from the attack and is transitioning to his natural state. And so that's the essence of frame data. Combat systems often take into account this model because it works so well. Of course, there might be other different ways of approaching the structure of an attack, but this one is the most common pattern. So we have talked about frame data, the base structure of a combat system, features of a combat system, NPCs with combat systems integrated into them, and things to avoid when making a combat system. And so now begs the question, what actually makes a good combat system? The answer to that question is ambiguous. It really just depends on what kind of combat system is desired. For example, Dark Souls approach their combat system in a way that is on the more realistic side. The Mortal Kombat games approach their combat system more fast-paced with more unrealistic speed. That being said, there are still some key ideas that all combat systems should integrate, such as adding debounce to your attacks, having a frame data structure, and one we haven't talked about, which is having a visually appealing framework. But that's it for this video. Remember that you should not treat these notes as demands for your combat system, otherwise nobody would create no unique ones, but rather treat them as standards. Thanks for watching.